Hundreds killed, thousands fleeing the country. So, is Nicaragua's President Daniel Ortega facing a legitimate revolution or a violent coup? I'm Mehdi Hassan. With allegations of anti-Semitism surrounding the UK's Labour Party and its leader Jeremy Corbyn, we'll debate whether the British left has a problem with anti-Jewish hatred and how much these accusations have to do with criticism of Israel. But first, since April of this year, Nicaragua's faced a political crisis, with both supporters and opponents of President Daniel Ortega clashing in the streets. Hundreds have been killed and thousands wounded, many of them at the hands of pro-government militias, according to human rights groups. As many are calling for Ortega to resign, he insists it's all part of an attempted coup. But does his government take any responsibility for the violence and the chaos? I'll ask this week's headliner, Nicaragua's Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Val Drac. Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Val Drac, thanks for joining me on UpFront. Nicaragua this year has been in crisis. Since April, you have hundreds of people reported killed, thousands wounded, armed groups attacking civilians on the streets, thousands of Nicaraguans fleeing to neighboring Costa Rica. Does your government, the government of Daniel Ortega, take any responsibility for any of that?
The government of Nicaragua faced a violent criminal coup. The reason we call it a coup is because its fundamental and main objective was to overthrow the constitutionally elected government of Nicaragua, an election that happened just recently in 2016, and that was recognized by many international organizations, including the OAS, as expressing the will of the people. That violent uprising, that violent coup, was perpetrated by a group of political motivated fringes of political parties, NGOs, who then mobilized through manipulation, terror, and fear the population of Nicaragua.
So a lot of governments, a lot of human rights activists, a lot of journalists have objected to your description of it as a coup. They say you haven't brought forward evidence. You say it is a coup. Isn't the easiest way to solve this to allow UN observers who you invited into the country earlier this year to finish their job rather than kicking them out, as your government did in August when they asked for greater access to prisons and to other areas of public life?
We did not kick out the UN Human Rights Commission. We invited the UN monitors to accompany the government and the dialogue, especially the Council of Bishops, in organizing what we call the Verification Commission that was supposed to go on the streets and try to verify what was happening. That is what we invited them to do. That reason was not any longer needed because...
Well, it is needed because you're telling the world there was a coup. You're saying that all the protesters are the ones doing the killing. The UN are saying, hold on, we've got evidence otherwise. And you say, goodbye, we're revoking the invitation to the UN.
198, now 200 deaths, that are the result of a coup.
That's not what the United Nations monitors say.
But it is result of the coup. I'm saying those
that's your opinion, is my point.
Well, it's somebody else's opinion.
Okay, and I'm
also
saying the United Nations, who are a pretty credible group of people, it's not the CIA coming to check on the ground.
Yes, but I'm saying
the UN are saying that we've seen human rights abuses, we want to go into prisons, we're not let into prisons, we're getting reports of killing of civilians.
We have just released the number of prisoners and the conditions what the prisoners are doing. What we are saying is that we did not invite United Nations for that specific activity.
I get that point.
No? So therefore,
I'm saying, but why not let them investigate if you're claiming a coup?
That's a decision.
That's normally what countries do. They go to the international community and say there's a coup against us.
But we are claiming
You've provided no evidence and you chucked out the UN.
No, we're claiming
Makes
a coup.
you look suspicious, doesn't it?
The evidence is very simple. The mobilization on the street was to overthrow violently the government. If that is not a reason, and if that is not the definition of a coup, then what is the definition of a coup?
The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has said you're sliding into a dangerous spiral of violence and impunity. Amnesty says Nicaragua is turning into a pressure cooker about to explode because of serious human rights violations permitted by your government. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights says you should seriously investigate the killings. Human Rights Watch says the same. Are all these groups making it up? Are they all part of your coup attempt?
We invited the Inter-American Human Rights Commission to help us understand what happened at the beginning. Okay. And they, instead, because of their methodology, using information coming from NGO local organizations without any verification, began to define these activities. We say that what happened on the streets was perpetrated by a group of very radical and very violent military activists.
Do you have their names?
I can show you the photos.
So you've arrested them?
We have arrested them, and we are in the process of arresting them. And that is we don't have political prisoners. Okay. There isn't one single
human rights
person.
Groups disagree with you on the death.
There isn't
they disagree with you on political prisoners.
One single political
human rights groups
prisoner.
Say 400 people are being held since April.
We have captured, and that is what the human rights organization, even the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, asked us to do. Okay. They told us,
here's what I'm confused.
We cannot look at these. We cannot look at non-state violence.
You are the vice foreign minister of the country. Yes, you are traveling the world speaking on behalf of your government. I'm asking a very simple question. When the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights are all saying that you are killing civilians, that you are holding political prisoners, why are they saying that? Are they
because
is it a conspiracy?
They are feeding from a number of organizations.
So all of them have got it wrong. The most famous human rights groups in the world. And the Nicaraguan government is telling the truth.
Do you understand the concept of homogenization of the discourse? This is what we're saying. The information that is coming out of Nicaragua is manipulated, and it is based on false premises.
Isn't the problem that when I look at it as an outsider, the human rights groups are admitting what you're saying? They're saying policemen have been killed by protesters.
Not only policemen.
Okay. But they're criticizing. My point is they're criticizing protesters.
More than 60% of those killed are government sympathizers or government workers.
Let me just ask you this. The human rights groups are criticizing both sides. You're saying you've killed no one. They sound more impartial than you do.
We're saying that the police has responded to armed attacks. That's what we're saying.
So when in
that
May,
is the base.
So in May, when pro-government militias killed 16 protesters in what was basically a massacre on Nicaragua's Mother's Day.
We don't have militias.
So who are the people in the masks?
These people in the masks are police and voluntary police. We have a law.
What are volunteer police?
The law of 1992, the police law of 1992, the police law of 1996, and the police law of 2002 or 2006 recognizes that the police uses voluntary police, which is a group, is a set of citizens who support the police.
Let me ask you about the examples that are given by some of the reports. A woman told the United Nations that a group of hooded men detained my husband at our house, beat him, took him away naked. Is she lying? The pregnant woman who told Associated Press that she was hit in the face, slapped by a group of police and volunteer police. They crushed my fingers, hit me in the ribs and stomach. When I was on the ground, they kicked me. Is she lying too? Are all these protesters lying?
The Nicaraguan police has been recognized publicly and in the world as a human right, a police that respects human rights.
That's false.
That's
flat false. I literally read to you quotes from Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, the Inter-American Association of Human Rights, the United Nations.
The Nicaraguan police has been recognized
in the past,
as a police.
Not this year.
And you can't have a police.
That's just a false statement. Sorry to break that to you.
A basic concept is
you can't matter, Minister. You cannot just come and say a false statement. Human rights groups do not recognize the Nicaraguan police this year as respecting human rights. That is a flat,
Nicaraguan
false statement.
Does not violate human rights.
That's fine. That's your opinion.
Nicaraguan
you cannot claim that human rights groups respect the Nicaraguan police.
What I am saying is there's human rights organizations are feeding off of biased, politically biased
except the Nicaraguan government.
No.
So I'm asking a question. The women, hold on, let me ask my question again, because you're not the women who say, a pregnant woman, fellow Nicaraguan citizen who you represent, you're the government, elected government. Yes. When she says the volunteer police beat me, kicked me in the stomach, that doesn't worry you? Doesn't bother you? Have you launched the investigation?
It worries me, and we are carrying out every single investigation that's necessary to understand what happened. That is the origin of the invitation of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission.
So how many people have been prosecuted in your volunteer police or militias, as most people call them?
We are carrying out the investigation. We are right now in the process of carrying to the courts every single one of those who are in the roadblocks. You must remember that...
I just want to be clear. I just want to be clear, because people might confuse what you're saying. The people you're prosecuting, you're saying you're prosecuting people on both sides of the demonstrations?
What I'm saying, we are beginning to prosecute people who have committed crimes, and that is a process that is ongoing. The police was off of the streets of Nicaragua for 51 days by request of the bishops. And the most heinous crimes were committed in those 51 days between the end of April and the middle of June. Since July 15th.
Okay, the police were off the streets, but the volunteer police were not. Daniel Ortega, who is now 70, has spent more time in power, 21 years over 2 stints, than the late brutal dictator he helped overthrow in 1979, Somoza. President Ortega hasn't just abolished term limits, he also seems to have brought back family rule to Nicaragua. The vice president is his wife, and his children have been appointed to key advisory positions in government. Is it any wonder then that his critics are saying he's the new Somoza, the new dynastic leader?
That is bringing back the whole idea of polarization, number one, and number two. I don't see any one of the children on the government payroll. That is, I don't see that.
Hold on,
advisory.
Two of his daughters are advisors.
Yes, but they are not on the government payroll, and we're not going to get into that discussion because you.
Okay, we're going to go into who pays them. Okay, but they're government advisors. They have power. But they have power.
They have power. Now let's go back to other examples. But come here, the vice president of the country, for many reasons, constitutional reasons, she has a right to run. For political reasons, she has been a cadre in the Sandinista movement historically, and we have a law, what we call the 50-50 law, that you have to have a candidate for president. The vice president has to be, if one is a man, the other one has to be a woman.
Great.
But what you're telling me is that because...
You're telling me gender balance is the reason she's the vice president. He couldn't find any other women in Nicaragua except for his wife.
Maybe they could, but what I'm saying is you have a cadre that has been historically a part of the Sandinista movement.
Okay.
Yes, there may be other people. Of course there are.
Let's talk about the Sandinista. Let's talk about the Sandinista movement. The president's own brother, Humberto Ortega, who was in charge of the armed forces for many years, he says, quote, "This is not a dictatorship, but it's very authoritarian, family-dominated style of governing." Is he part of a coup, a conspiracy against his brother?
What I'm saying is he has his own position.
I know
and
that.
He has his own position, and he has a right to have his own position.
I didn't ask about it. I asked about the position.
I am not saying...
Is he part of the conspiracy?
I don't see he's part of any conspiracy.
So why is he saying you're authoritarian
Well, that's his opinion of the government of his own brother.
So when I look at so many high-profile figures who were supporters of yours in the 1980s, supported the Sandinista struggle, who are now shocked at what your government are doing. The philosopher Noam Chomsky says there's been a lot of corruption, a lot of repression, your government is autocratic. The celebrity activist Bianca Jagger says Daniel Ortega may be worse than Somoza, he's a war criminal. Jaconda Belli, the Nicaraguan poet, former Sandinista activist, joined your movement in 1970. She says Ortega and his wife have turned Nicaragua into a land of terror. Why are all these people who spent their lives supporting you, supporting your party, your government, why are they now saying this stuff? Are they part of the conspiracy?
They shifted. They shifted when we lost the elections in 1990.
Noam Chomsky shifted in 1990.
No, I'm saying they shifted when we lost the election. We're talking about the Sandinistas.
I quoted you, Chomsky, saying your government is autocratic. Chomsky is one of the longest-standing supporters of the Sandinista movement in the entire Western world.
Chomsky, who is the best explainer of how this whole media manipulation system happens, can have his opinion. But you're talking to me about homogeneous opinions?
Okay, let me ask you this. You have a situation now where, as you say, what you call a coup, others are calling, protests, legitimate protests. What is the solution to this crisis then? What are you going to do about these people who are taking to the streets? Just carry on shooting at them?
No, we're not carrying on shooting at them. Since July 15th, when we recaptured the streets, when we moved away, when we removed the barricades, there hasn't been one single person died.
One last question. As you deepen democracy, will you be supporting President Ortega if he runs again in 2021?
That's a decision of the Congress of the party.
But you're in favor of that?
And personally, if President Ortega runs, I would be supporting President Ortega.
You're fine with president for life?
I am not saying president for life.
Okay.
I am saying the Sandinista is an evolving movement, a very strong nationalist movement who is there to strengthen democracy and to strengthen the development of the country. That is what was being destroyed in this perpetrated coup.
Vice Foreign Minister, thanks for joining me on Upfront.
Thank you very much.
The UK Labour Party has been hit by accusations of anti-Semitism in recent months, especially against its leader, Jeremy Corbyn. His fellow Labour MP, Margaret Hodge, who lost members of her family in the Holocaust, said Corbyn was an anti-Semitic racist, while 3 of the main Jewish newspapers in the UK described him as an existential threat to British Jews. The Labour leader has been accused of sharing platforms with Holocaust deniers and making offensive remarks about British Zionists. His supporters, though, argue that Corbyn is a lifelong anti-racist and that the attacks attacks against him are smears designed to discredit his strong support for Palestinians and prevent criticism of Israel. So, is the Labour leader really guilty of anti-Semitism or even of turning a blind eye to it? Joining me from London to debate this are Michael Rosen, an award-winning novelist and poet and a Jewish Corbyn supporter, and Daniela Peled, a writer and contributor to the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, a former foreign editor of the Jewish Chronicle and a Jewish Corbyn critic. Thank you both for joining me in the arena. Daniela, speaking on Wednesday at his party's annual conference in Liverpool, Jeremy Corbyn said, "We will work with Jewish communities to eradicate anti-Semitism, both from our party and wider society." He says there's a problem. He says he's dealing with it. That doesn't sound like an anti-Semite, does it?
Mr. Corbyn has not won the confidence, the support of the vast majority of British Jews. And although you can find his supporters have cherry-picked Jewish people who are speaking out in support of him, I've never seen such a consensus amongst this very, very diverse community feeling that Labour is no longer a comfortable place for them.
And for our global audience who haven't been following the details of this, how would you sum up, in kind of, if you can sum it up, why the British Jewish community has this consensus that Labour is no longer a comfortable place for them?
Well, look, Mr. Corbyn is part of the traditionally far left of Labour, who have quite a binary view of the world, divided up into nice anti-imperialists like Iran, Russia, Assad and Syria, and the nasty Western imperialists like America, Israel, NATO, the EU as well. And in this very binary reading of foreign affairs, Jews end up as white imperialists. And I think this worldview has now become quite dominant in the party. And that makes Jewish people who are not really that bothered about Israel one way or another, feel that they are being sidelined and being discriminated against. And most importantly, that when they say this is anti-Semitism and they call out instances of prejudice, they're told that this is somehow a smear.
Michael Rosen, it's not all a smear, is it?
Well, I think, first of all, we're going to have to rank back a bit and sort out some definitions here. We talk about the Jewish community as if there is just one community. It's not really, strictly speaking, true. And there are plenty of Jews in the Labour Party. I'm not in the Labour Party, but I support Jeremy Corbyn.
Michael, just to be clear, do you at least recognise, we can argue about the numbers, but a big chunk of the British Jewish community is unhappy with Labour under Corbyn because they perceive it as not a safe space or a comfortable space or a friendly space for British Jews? You concede that is the perception, even if you disagree with the reasoning behind it.
Yes, of course, absolutely. But then, of course, exactly as Daniela says, a large percentage of the Jewish community, if that's what we're going to call it, large percentage of Jews are in favour of Israel, but not all Jews, some aren't. And I have no attachment to that place over there, but of course I understand that plenty of Jews do. Plenty of Jews are brought up to believe that Israel is their homeland, even if they don't make it their homeland. It is there for them, as they believe, of course. But there are other people living there. This is the crucial point about Israel. There are other people not recognised by the recent nation-state law.
Daniela, how much of this is to do with the Israel-Palestine conflict, with this thorny debate over Zionism, anti-Zionism, when you do have the chief rabbi and the former chief rabbi of the UK both saying that anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism? It does muddy the water when we're trying to work out what is bigotry, what is hatred, what is legitimate political criticism, doesn't it?
Well, I think the real problem here is this accusation that critics of Corbyn, Jewish critics of Corbyn, are criticising him as part of a smear campaign because their real interests are in defending Israel, apparently, or they're all conservative voters who are weaponising anti-Semitism as this political tool. And that feeds straight into all those classic anti-Semitic tropes that I've been exposed to as well, mostly as a reporter writing about Israel-Palestine, that Jews are more loyal to each other and by extension Israel than to the countries that they live in and the countries that they're citizens of. Now, this doesn't, Jeremy Corbyn's comments about Zionists not understanding irony are a classic example of this kind of attitude that I've experienced over and over again. And I think that is the most wounding and the most damaging part of this whole thing.
Michael, I just want to drill down into Labour and Jeremy Corbyn. I just want to get your sense of where you stand here. Is your position that Jeremy Corbyn, that he's done nothing wrong and that this is a smear campaign from the right or from supporters of Israel? Or is it your position that perhaps he's used bad language in the past or he's said the wrong thing? Or does he have a blind spot for this stuff, maybe? That's what some have suggested, supporters of his. Where do you stand?
I think the basic mistake, if he has made mistakes, is he hasn't been vocal enough in defying and picking back, if you like, because he's not a linguist. He's a politician, and he thinks that he has an honourable thing to do, which is to support the rights of justice and peace in the Middle East and justice for the Palestinians. And he thinks that has nothing to do directly with discrimination against Jews, or indeed prejudice against Jews in Britain. That's what he thinks. Okay. And by and large, I agree with that.
Daniela.
Michael, it would be interesting to know from you then what would be my motivations as a lifelong Labour voter for saying there is a real problem with anti-Semitism in Labour. Am I part of a smear? Am I in the part of a Conservative smear or being funded by the Israeli embassy? There are plenty of people who stand up for Palestinian rights and say there is a problem. You're tying yourself in knots to try and justify what's not justifiable. When Boris Johnson made his really rather unpleasant comments about Muslim women looking like letterboxes, people dealt with those comments as they were on their merits, or rather their lack of merits. No one was saying this is part of a left-wing conspiracy trying to derail a potential government led by Boris Johnson. Let's look at what he has said and judge it on its merits, and those merits are very lacking.
Well, as it happens, Daniela, I haven't said it's a right-wing conspiracy or anybody's conspiracy sitting here. If some people do, well, you know, they've worked out that maybe there are some relationships between Jews in Britain and Israel and Israelis. I'm not saying that, though what I would say is that the media in this country was very reluctant to point out that
there's
some
no
of the
allegations
chief
of
people
smear
who were most vocal, were most vocal about it, had very important positions and recognised positions in the Conservative Party, all right? And so had those links. And indeed, the ex-chief rabbi was a very fond of Margaret Thatcher. So it's not as if the only agenda these people had in attacking Corbyn was simply
So the chief rabbi is making accusations of anti-Semitism because he's a Tory?
Well, all I'm saying is that just to not investigate other reasons why people might want to attack a Labour leader is quite important. You remember the last Labour leader we had was attacked for having a father who was a Jewish traitor by a Tory newspaper, the Daily Mail.
Ed Miliband, who was the first Jewish leader of the Labour Party, didn't win a majority of Jewish support in 2015, and a lot of the anti-Semitism cases at a local level did turn up on his leadership, on his watch. So it is, some would say it is unfair to put this all at Corbyn's door, the bad relationship between the Labour Party and British Jewish communities. Would you concede that?
I think, as I said, I think it's symptomatic of a wider issue, the fact that his leadership has emboldened a section of the far left that has always held these really rather extreme views towards British Jews as being wealthy, as being part of the ruling class, as being capitalists and as being imperialists. And Corbyn has not taken significant action. He hasn't spoken out and he hasn't apologised or made consultations in any kind of
Daniela, he has apologised several times.
And believe me, I'm not speaking
He has apologised several times, though, hasn't he, for making mistakes, for not dealing with this soon enough? And he's now come out this week in the conference and said, we want to eradicate anti-Semitism, we won't tolerate this in the party.
He is
and
clearly,
repeatedly
like
in the House of Commons supported Jews. Over 20 years, he's supported early day motions, as we call them in the House of Commons here, supported Jews 10 times over the last 25 years. So, you know, he's no
All you're doing, Michael, is you're telling me there isn't a problem.
If you were the Viktor Orban, I will say to you that, of course, there is a problem, as there is in the whole of society. I'm repeating, if you like, exactly what John Lansman, the leader of one of the supporting groups, but there are plenty of Jews in the Labour Party. I came from a left-wing Jewish tradition that thought that one of the ways we could deal with our problems in the world was to find universal values. And one of the ways was to join Labour and socialist parties.
Michael, just on the issue of the problem, Daniela is saying you're Daniela is saying that you're denying the problem, and you're saying there's a problem in Labour as there is with the rest of society. Corbyn himself said in a statement recently, anyone who denies that this has surfaced in our party is clearly actually wrong and contributing to the problem. It's not enough to just say, well, everyone's got an anti-Semitism problem and therefore do a bit of whataboutism, is it?
I agree, because obviously the Labour Party is founded on universalistic ideas of human rights. It claims to be an anti-racist party. So, of course, Jeremy Corbyn will say, well, we do have a problem if we have any anti-Semites in the Labour Party. There may be anti-Semites out there in society, but it's our job to root it out of the Labour Party. Indeed.
So let me ask you this, Daniela, before we finish. What is the solution moving forward for this fraught relationship between British Jews and the Labour Party under Corbyn? Is there a solution, or is it too late?
I'm afraid I can't see one right now. I think that there's been a lack of effort to show goodwill, a lack of communication, and I think this extends to a wide range of issues. I have personally more problems with the Labour Party's view on Syria, or on Ukraine and other foreign affairs issues than I do on Israel-Palestine. But I think the gap is just too large, and trust has been eroded, perhaps for a long time to come.
Michael, trust has been eroded. How does Jeremy Corbyn get it back, or can he not get it back?
I don't know. I'm no great crystal ball gazer, but the interesting thing here is the question to ask is, are those people who are opposed to Jeremy Corbyn over this matter, are they interested in eradicating anti-Semitism, or are they interested in eradicating Jeremy Corbyn? That's what the plotting all this summer and before has been about. Let's get rid of Corbyn.
Michael Rosen, Daniela Peled, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining me in the arena. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.